I've come to the floor today to talk about the legislation before us, the banking legislation that's been reported out of the Banking Committee on a bipartisan vote and awaits our attention here today. Like my colleague from Washington State, I also want to just speak briefly to the issue that's being raised in states across America and schools across America, where students are demonstrating their support, their solidarity with folks at Parkland in Florida who lost 17 kids earlier this year. My dad was a hunter, grew up in West Virginia, born in West Virginia, grew up in Virginia. Bought my first BB gun, Mr. President, when I was 10 years old. And I still have the shotgun that my grandfather gave me just before he died when I was just a pup of a teenager. And we're big believers in my family in Second Amendment rights, to own and bear arms. We're also a big advocate for using common sense and with respect to weapons. My dad was not only just a hunter, but he was also a gun collector. And he would buy and sell guns to other people that he knew. My dad was, from the time my sister and I were little kids, he would always say to us, he'd always say, just use some common sense. He said it a lot to us when we were growing up. We must not have had much, because he said it very often. And but my dad would have said it doesn't make common sense to be able, for somebody who has a serious mental health problems, or someone who has like a felony record, to be able to go into a gun show and buy a weapon. That doesn't make a lot of sense. And the idea of allowing people who can't fly in an airplane because they're on a terrorist watch list to be able to go in and buy guns. My dad would say that just didn't make a whole lot of sense. And so I just hope that at the end of the day, what's happening across the country, the kids are leading us. There's a verse of scripture in the Bible. It says a child shall lead them. And I think that's really what's going on here. And I think states are already starting to address this issue, I think in a more constructive way than we have thus far. But my hope is that states, the children will lead us, and the states will lead us as well, and maybe we'll be able to come to agreement on some of these issues that are respectful of Second Amendment rights in the Constitution, but also are consistent with the kind of common sense that my dad always talked about, with respect to everything, including the buying and selling of weapons. Mr. President, I remember standing on this floor, I think it was about 8 years ago, when we debated the Affordable Care Act. That was a time when we were spending about 18% of GDP for healthcare in this country, 18%. The Japanese were spending 8%. They had better results in Japan in their healthcare than we did. And they covered everybody. Think about that. We're spending 18%, they were spending 8%. They got better results in healthcare, longer life longevity for adults, lower rates of infant mortality. And they covered everybody, and when people were going to bed in this country at that time, 40 million people went to bed at night without any health care coverage. And I think most of us realized at the time that that's not a good thing. I used to say, Japanese can't be that smart, we can't be that dumb. And we passed the Affordable Care Act, a lot of debate, a lot of amendments offered in committees, including Finance Committee, where I serve, Republican amendments, Democratic amendments. The final vote here on the floor was not a bipartisan vote, as we know. It was a huge issue that we were trying to address, deliver health care to 300 million Americans. And there was not, and even for those who supported the legislation, we realized it was not perfect, and that we're going to have to come back at some point in time and make changes to it. And Democrats felt that way, Republicans, Independents felt that way as well. We ended up not coming back and making modest amendments or tweaks to the legislation, but at the end of the day, we ended up with a battle here over repeal, initially repeal the ACA and later on repeal and replace. But I felt proud of the work we'd done on the ACA, knowing it's not perfect. Always look forward to coming back shortly after we adopted, actually, and do some tweaks. I felt the same way about Dodd-Frank, banking legislation that we passed after the Great Recession, again, about 7 or 8 years ago. I'll just remind everybody, especially our young pages here today, they were probably about 7 or 8 years old at the time. And what happened is we fell not into a burning ring of fire, but we fell off a cliff, man. Unemployment rate shot up to 10%. Banks stopped lending money to send kids to school or allow people to buy a car or a house. Credit was shut off for businesses as well. Unemployment rates skyrocketed. our economy was like locked up. And we felt we had to do something. And what we tried to do was figure out how we ended up in that mess in the first place. And what had gone on is that people who wanted to buy a house were not creditworthy, ended up being loaned money by banks across the country to buy houses. In many cases, the appraisals for the house weren't worth the paper they were written on. The folks, the creditworthiness of the borrowers was not worth the paper it was written on as well. So we had really unqualified people and trying to buy property that they were unable, really and realistically, to repay their loans. It all worked just fine until we went into a slump, and as unemployment rates started to go up, people found it more and more difficult to make their payments. In the olden days, and I remember the first houses that we lived in when I was a kid, my parents borrowed money for a mortgage from a bank, and they paid it off to that bank. I remember when we paid off the house, they paid off the mortgage of the house that they owned in, my sister and I grew up as little kids, in Danville, Virginia. It was a big deal. And I remember my dad actually took the mortgage and he burned it up, and outside, not inside our house. But by 7 or 8 years ago, a lot of people, after they borrowed their money from a bank, the bank sold that mortgage to somebody else, oftentimes to Fannie Mae or Freddie Mac. And Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac would package those mortgages into mortgage-backed securities, into a security that could be sold to investors in this country, investors around the world. As long as housing prices continued to rise, everything worked fine. When they stopped rising and started falling, a number of those mortgage-backed securities were riddled, almost like Swiss cheese, with bad mortgages. And as more and more people failed to be able to pay their mortgages, the mortgage-backed securities lost their value, and those investors around the world who'd invested seriously in mortgage-backed securities got scared, and it sort of spiraled down from there. That was really not the only reason we got into that burning ring of fire all those years ago. It was a big reason. And part of what we sought to do with Dodd-Frank is to make sure that didn't happen again. To make sure we'll make other mistakes, we're not going to make that mistake again. And the legislation was passed. Again, not everybody was for it. I voted for it, helped to write some of the provisions in the bill. But I knew at the time that, and I think we all did, that anything that big, a massive change in our banking regulatory approach in this country, was going to have to be tweaked and revisited, just like the Affordable Care Act. And it's taken a while. Our Republican friends, for the most part, they were interested in, not all, probably not including the presiding officer, were interested in repealing Dodd-Frank. I was interested, and I think a majority of the folks on our side were interested in fixing the provisions that need to be fixed, but not to throw the baby out with the bathwater. The legislation before us today was reported out of the Banking Committee, not unanimously, reported out, I think, last fall. And the chairman of the committee, Mike Crapo from Idaho, his name is on the bill. But I'm going to spend some time here today to talk about what it does and what it doesn't do. If the bipartisan bill before us today becomes law, 90% of Dodd-Frank will remain unchanged. Let me say that again. If the banking bill before us today becomes law, 90% of Dodd-Frank would remain unchanged. The legislation authored by Senator Crapo and a number of others does not touch some of Dodd-Frank's most important reforms. And some of those most important reforms include the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau remains. Financial Stability Oversight Council, affectionately known as FSOC, but the Financial Stability Oversight Council, which works to identify and to address overarching threats to the financial system, remains. The regulations cracking down on risky derivative trading remain. And the ability of the FDIC to wind down failing complex institutions through an orderly liquidation authority remain. Under this legislation, the Federal Reserve would retain the authority to apply enhanced standards to any bank over $100 billion in assets. In addition, banks over $100 billion would still be subject to numerous regulatory requirements. Among those requirements are included: 1, meaningful stress tests; 2, increased capital requirements to provide a cushion in tough times and bad times; and 3rd, vital international reforms to leverage and liquidity standards. I have a number of charts. I have more charts here today than I think I've ever brought to the Senate floor. Mr. President, I promise we'll be done by sundown. It'll seem that long, but in reality it won't be. But I wanted to start off, if I could, with a couple of claims about the bill, claims made about the bill, and then talk about the reality. And one of the claims is that this bill would gut Wall Street reform, which was passed after the financial crisis to prevent another global meltdown. That's the claim. Here's the reality. This bipartisan bill makes targeted, common sense fixes that will provide tangible relief to community banks and credit unions while leaving in place the rules and regulations that will keep Wall Street accountable. And before we look at the next claim, Mr. President, like you, I do customer calls all over my state. You have a big state. I have a little state. I visit businesses large and small. We just visit schools, you name it, hospitals. But I do customer calls literally every week, and including the credit unions, including to small community banks. Sometimes they came to see me, but oftentimes I go to see them. For years, during those customer calls, visiting credit unions, for years visiting community banks, especially in central and southern part of our state. They say to us, we didn't create the meltdown, the financial meltdown that led us into the Great Recession, yet we bear the burden of the regulatory reform for that meltdown. It wasn't our fault. And we needed a lot of the regulation that was adopted in Dodd-Frank, but just keep in mind, credit unions, community banks didn't cause the problem, yet they bear part of the burden of fixing it. Let's see. Another claim. This bill rolls back stress test requirements for all big banks. I'll say it again. This bill rolls back stress test requirements for all big banks. That's the claim. Here's the reality. This bill continues to require stress tests for all banks with over $100 billion in assets. That would be the largest financial institutions. That's the reality. The claim. This bill does nothing to protect consumers. That's the claim. The bill does nothing to protect consumers. Here's the reality. This bill actually creates new protections. Provides free credit freezes and allows year-long fraud reports. It allows parents to turn credit reporting on and off for minors. Provides free credit monitoring for all active duty service members. I'm a retired Navy captain. Our presiding officer is colonel and Navy salutes. Was one of the things that Senator Coons and I insisted on in order to support this legislation was free credit monitoring for all active duty service members as part of the bill. And another reality in terms of new protections is that this legislation encourages banks to report suspicious behavior they become aware of. Now, that's a little bit of claim and reality. I could go on that, but I won't. I'm going to actually turn to the words of other people, not my own, and starting off with questions from Senator John Tester, Montana, who's a senior member of the Banking Committee. And the first question he's asking was asked last November, and the person that he was asking was a fellow that had been would be nominated to be chairman of the Federal Reserve. His name Jay Powell. And so it was confirmed here on this floor, I think, with 80 or 90 votes, big bipartisan vote. But Senator Tester asked of then, I think he was a governor, if I'm not mistaken at the time, not a governor of the state, but a governor within the Federal Reserve System. He asked of Jay Powell, he said, part of that bill, this bill, the bill that's before us today, is eliminating the Volcker Rule compliance for community banks that have less than $10 billion in assets, as long as they have less than 5% trading assets and liabilities. And Senator Tester asked of now Federal Reserve Chairman Jay Powell, do you have any concerns there? And the witness, now Chairman of the Federal Reserve, Jay Powell, said literally 2-3 months ago, none. None. Senator Tester went on to ask the Federal Reserve Chairman, I think this was February of last year, and he asked, and this is what Senator Tester, my colleague, knows, he's a farmer, and in Montana, he says to Jay Powell, who's not yet the chairman of the Federal Reserve, but is now, Senator Tester said, but I'm a dirt farmer, okay? I just kind of read things as they are and don't read a lot of extra stuff into it. You're the man on the Fed, and so I need to know your opinion. And Senator Tester goes on to say to Jay Powell, he says, does this bill 2155, Senate 2155, does it require the Federal Reserve to weaken any of the Dodd-Frank enhanced prudential standards for foreign banks, such as Deutsche Bank and UBS or Barclays? That was the question. Here was the response of Jay Powell, now the chairman of the Federal Reserve. It does not, according to my reading of the text. I would just add the text of the bill. See what we have next. Senator Crapo, chairman of the banking committee, who's put together this bipartisan legislation, led the way with a lot of help from John Tester, Senator Tester, and others. Senator Crapo asked, this is a hearing in last July, and he's asking the woman who's then the chairman of the Federal Reserve, I think she did, Janet Yellen did a very, very good job. Stepped down, we were grateful for her service and leadership. Senator Crapo asked of then chairman of the Federal Reserve, Janet Yellen, he says, Chairman Yellen, there appears to be growing consensus that Congress should consider changing the $50 billion SIFI threshold for significantly big banks, but changing that $50 billion SIFI threshold, also changing the Volcker Rule, exempting certain institutions from company-run stress testing requirements and reducing the burdens on community banks and credit unions. And he went on to ask her, he said, do you agree that it would be appropriate for Congress to act in each of those areas? That's what he asked. He said, do you believe it would be appropriate for Congress to act in each of those areas, changing the $50 billion SIFI threshold, changing the Volcker Rule, exempting certain institutions from the stress test requirements, reducing the burdens on community and credit unions? Do you agree that it would be appropriate for Congress to act in each of those instances? What did she say? She said 4 words. I do, I do. Next, let's see. Who do we have here? And again, February last year, Federal Reserve Chairman Janet Yellen on the Volcker Rule. She says, so yes, let me reiterate what I said there. It's important to look for every way we can to mitigate the regulatory burden. What we've suggested previously, and I would reiterate with respect to Dodd-Frank, is that Congress might want to consider exempting community banks from the Volcker Rule. That's what she said last February, a year ago. And the person who was in the Federal Reserve Governor, Dan Torello, I think is a position now held by Randy Quarles at the Federal Reserve, but this was Dan last April, who also we were indebted to for the job that he did at the Federal Reserve. But Governor Torello said, we have found that the $50 billion asset threshold established in the Dodd-Frank Act for banks to be systemically important, and that subject to a range of stricter regulations was set not too high, was set too low. He went on to say the fact that community banks are subject to at all to some of the Dodd-Frank Act rules seems unnecessary. Say it again. The fact that community banks are subject at all to some of the Dodd-Frank rules seems unnecessary to protect safety and soundness, and quite burdensome on the very limited compliance capabilities of these small banks. Dan Torello's words, last April rather. And here are the words of former Federal Reserve Chairman Paul Volcker, whom I got to know and work with when I was in the House of Representatives. And he was chairman of the Federal Reserve. I was on the banking committee He was a giant then and still is, literally and figuratively. But here's what Paul Volcker said, and these are his words of February of this year, February 21st, in fact. He said, "I'm pleased that the Senate Banking Committee has forged ahead with meaningful bipartisan financial reform to ease the unnecessary regulatory strain on small banks, helping them flourish as an engine of economic prosperity." And he goes on to say he doesn't agree with every single word of the legislation that's before us today, but he concluded his thoughts by saying, "I thank you for the opportunity to comment on this important piece." This is in a letter to Senator Brown, I believe. "I thank you for the opportunity to comment on this important piece of legislation and look forward to its swift passage." Let me read that again. Did I read that right? I did. "I thank you," again in the letter to Senator Brown, "I thank you for the opportunity to comment on this important piece of legislation and look forward to its swift passage." And that doesn't mean he'd agree with every single sentence, paragraph, but he looks forward to its swift passage, and we need to keep that in mind. Former Congressman, former Banking Committee Chairman, my former colleague, Barney Frank, on whether Dodd-Frank needs reforms. And he replied, this is an interview on CNBC last February, a year ago. And he was asking whether Dodd-Frank needs reforms. He said, quote, "Of course." And on the $50 billion SIFI threshold, he said, "I think it should be changed." And he went on to say, "It's too low." I believe it is. Again, from former Congressman Barney Frank, former chairman of the Banking Committee, this is November of last year, November 2017. "If this bill became law tomorrow, well over 90% of the Wall Street reform bill would be unchanged." He goes on to say the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau, the strict regulation of derivative trading, the orderly liquidation authority, the risk retention requirements on securitization, and most other provisions would remain in full force. In full force. And we're almost done here. I thank my colleague from Vermont for his patience. But former Chairman Barney Frank on relief for community banks. These words from CNBC, again, in the interview last February, so it looks like a year ago. "With regard to banks under $10 billion, some of them are spending more money than they should, complying with provisions that were never really intended to apply to them, and I understand that." He goes on to say the Volcker Rule, which says that large banks should do more lending and less derivative trading, which I think is a wholly good thing. A number of small banks which never did much derivative trading are overdoing the effort to show that they aren't there. And I would exempt some of the banks under $10 billion from some of those rules, and I would agree to raise the $50 billion threshold. And last but not least, a couple of comments. Here's one from the Bipartisan Policy Center recently. The words of two of the folks from there. "As U.S. politics descends even further into partisanship, there are still signs that old-fashioned legislating is not dead. This week, the Senate Banking Committee will mark up one of the first, I guess it was late last year, will mark up one of the first significant pieces of financial regulatory legislation in years with real bipartisan support." He went on to say these are not major changes yet taken together. They're constructive and should provide greater incentives to extend credit, particularly to Main Street small businesses, without undermining the progress made since the crisis in making the financial system safer. Two more and I'm done. This is from the president and CEO of the Independent Community Bankers of America. "The markup of this bill, S-2155, is a rare opportunity for real impactful relief that will strengthen economic growth, job creation, and consumer protection. It is a culmination of years of collaborative effort to achieve consensus among members of the Congress across the spectrum and community bankers in their home states and districts. Community bankers urge all members of the Senate Banking Committee to vote yes on Senate 2155. And finally, the bill, this is from the leader, president, CEO of Credit Union Association, National Credit Union Association, Jim Nussel. And then his words, "This bill includes credit union-specific provisions that provide meaningful regulatory relief, a sign that policymakers are paying close attention to the needs of credit union members." We want to say we thank Senator Crapo and all of his colleagues for working across party lines to advance regulatory relief legislation that benefits community financial institutions, and look forward to continuing to work closely with them as this bill moves through the legislative process. I hope we'll keep these words in mind in the hours ahead, days ahead, as we take up this important legislation. I have no interest in undoing Dodd-Frank, strong support of Dodd-Frank, helped to write some of the provisions on Dodd-Frank, and have no interest in pulling the plug on Dodd-Frank. Can we make some reasonable changes? Yes, we can. And I felt the same way about the Affordable Care Act. And with that, I would yield the floor to my friend from Vermont and thank him for his speech.